This video is about how America's two current political parties of any relevance, the Democrats and the Republicans, both came about, their history, and the evolution of their ideologies. The reason why America only has two political parties that currently have any sitting member of Congress or have came close to winning the presidency in more than 150 years is something called Duverger's Law, which is the idea that when you need just a plurality to win any office, which is how the American government works for the most part, this is called first past the post system. Similarly to in countries like the UK and Canada, naturally people coalesce behind just two candidates. America's two parties today, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both undergone a lot of evolution in their histories, given that most modern liberals, somewhat foundedly, consider Andrew Jackson horribly evil, and the idea that Donald Trump and Abraham Lincoln are a part of the same party is very funny. So in this series that is starting with this video, which will go up to about 1860, and part 2 should go all the way up to the present day. I've already written pretty much everything, I just made it 2 videos because I didn't want to make it too long. Anyway, you'll hear my opinions and the facts about the evolution of America's political parties up to that year. When the Constitution was being debated over, those who were in favor of adopting it, and also of adopting a generally more centralized federal government, would become the Federalist Party. They were associated with the North's business class and favored centralization and modernization, and some, in terms of slavery, were abolitionist. They formed around George Washington's Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, supporting his policies and that of the Washington administration in general. Those who opposed the Constitution coalesced around Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, at the time called the Republican Party and described by later historians usually as the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republicans favored a less centralized nation, drew support from the South's slave-owning planter gentry, as well as more generally from rural people, and supported the French Revolution. To a modern audience, a lot of this might sound a bit incongruent. The Democratic Republicans, for being largely aligned with the South and states' rights, would seem to crassly phrased within the modern framework anti-woke. But, of course, the Federalists stridently opposed the French Revolution, and the first and only Federalist president, although Washington was basically a Federalist, John Adams, elected in 1796 after Washington's 2 terms, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, recently invoked by Trump to deport Venezuelan alleged gang members, and led the country into an undeclared war with France. Debatably a less than great record, but he also helped shape the modern presidency and stuff. You might notice the Federalists don't really seem equipped to win votes in early 19th century America, with that list of policies being pro-British, the country British broke from, industrialist, and generally sneering at the concept of democracy. So, in 1800, in one of the first peaceful democratic transitions of power in a large, modern state, Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in a rematch of the 1796 election. Only 6 out of 16 states in that election used a popular vote, and those that did had heavy restrictions of the franchise, usually propertied white men. And Thomas Jefferson, in those states, won 60% of the vote and won the Electoral College. At the time, electors were chosen either by direct election by state or more commonly by the state legislature, as in people would vote directly for the presidential electors instead of the presidential candidate themselves. Also, each elector at this time cast 2 votes, and whoever won the second most would become vice president. This led to our first constitutional crisis when Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, the guy from Hamilton, tried to gain more electors than Jefferson, forcing the election to a contingent election in the House. After his 4-year vice presidency, he would peacefully retire to a life of, along with then General Andrew Jackson, attempting to seize the South as an independent country. But that's a story for another time. In the first party system, the Federalists were the pro-central government, pro-British, pro-economic modernization party, and according to their detractors, crypto-monarchists. Their detractors, the Democratic Republican Party, a coalition of agrarianists and liberals in the 18th century sense, described by their Federalist detractors as favoring mob rule, conclusively won. While Federalists dominated the cabinet and the country as a whole in George Washington's 2 terms, 1804's presidential election basically marked the end of the Federalists on a federal level and to a lesser extent in Congress. Now, the Democratic Republicans were able to draw support from all over the nation, including the plantation economy-dominated Deep South, the middle of the country, which were sort of like the swing states of the time, and even the Federalist stronghold of New England, with Jefferson winning Massachusetts in 1804. Jefferson, whose term was marked by westward expansion, repealing Adams' unpopular acts like pardoning those imprisoned under the Alien and Sedition Acts, and passing the Embargo Act, which prohibited certain imports, something popular with the Federalist base, but which, along with general conflict with Britain and to a lesser extent France, from which Louisiana was purchased in 1803, both engaged in the Napoleonic Wars at the time, would drag down Jefferson's popularity. During the War of 1812, the Federalists, the more pro-Britain party, gained popularity by strongly advocating for peace. Also in 1812, in that year's presidential election, the Federalists supported moderate Democratic Republican DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York, for president. And that was something of a harbinger of the fate of the Federalists being eventually merged into the right wing, although left and right aren't really that helpful here, maybe more like the northern wing of the Republicans. However, in 1816, James Monroe, the third consecutive Democratic Republican president, managed to avoid another party split, with the Federalist Rufus King losing every state using a popular vote, winning only 3 states in total. The Federalists were dogged by allegations of collaboration with Britain during the war, and claims of Federalist efforts for New England to secede and rejoin the British. The details of what happened from there aren't that important. I mean, they are, but let's not get bogged down in them. In 1820, almost at their historical low point for seats in Congress, the Federalists failed to agree on a candidate for president, and for the first time since Washington, and only the second time in American history. Democratic Republican James Monroe is unanimously re-elected for a second term, with one elector voting for John Quincy Adams just for fun. And 4 years later, however, would come another crazy presidential election, but not in the sense of having only one candidate, but rather in having four candidates. There were 4 of them. The 1824 election was maybe the craziest one ever. For the second time ever, the election, and by the way, only the second time this has ever happened, like the last time it's ever happened, the election went to a contingent election in the House, which, in what Andrew Jackson and his supporters called a corrupt bargain, the House chose John Quincy Adams. After a 4-way contest between him, a Democratic Republican but ideologically kind of Federalist adjacent, and one around whom the Federalist successor party would crystallize, although we'll get to that later, the Southern Jeffersonian Democratic Republican William H. Crawford, and in last place, the longtime Democratic Republican, then Adams Clay Republican, then Whig, Henry Clay, and the elephant in the room, and guy who won easily the biggest portion of the popular vote, but lost the election in the House, that being General Andrew Jackson. But getting back to Henry Clay and friends, what's an Adams Clay Republican, and what's a Whig, you may be wondering? Well, the ideological successor to the Federalists. The strong liberal tradition, the South's economic interests, ideological conservatives, and the North's ideological interests could not share the Democratic Republican Party for long. So after the 1824 election, the party split in two, the two factions being largely referred to at the time as Adams men and Jackson men. Adams was tarred by Jacksonians as an aristocrat and an authoritarian, and Jackson and his supporters as corrupt and supporting mob rule. Being crowned president in what was largely considered a corrupt bargain, Adams couldn't win 1828, so he didn't. Andrew Jackson, supported by the newly formed Democratic Party, our current one, made up of his former faction of Democratic Republicans, won in a near landslide. Also, 1828 was notable for the percent of total Americans, that's everyone in the whole country, going up from 3.4% voting in 1824 to 9.5%. Wow. The hallmark of Jackson's presidency would be expanding the franchise to poorer white men across the country. We'll get to the other details of his presidency later and talk about the new parties at birth first. Starting with the Democratic Party, 1828 marked something like the real stabilization of a two-party system, with no more 100% landslides happening from then on, although we've gotten pretty close. Today, the Democratic Party is one of the U.S.'s 2 major parties. The other, the Republicans, would come about 20 years later from the abolitionist movement. Jackson, as president, was, in the eyes of modern historians and people, mixed at best. He oversaw the expansion of democracy and defended the Constitution during the nullification crisis, but we can't talk about Jackson without talking about the fact that he, like several of his predecessors as president, including Jefferson, Washington, etc., was a slave owner and active supporter of slavery. I guess Jefferson wasn't a huge supporter, but he did own people, and directed the Indian Removal Act. When talking about bad things that happened, say 200 years ago, a lot of people might point to moral relativism and say that people thought differently back then. But there was an active abolitionist movement at the time, and the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears were controversial even at the time, passing the House by only a handful of votes. The Supreme Court decision, Worcester versus Georgia, made by John Marshall, a Federalist appointed by John Adams all those years ago, basically called it illegal, but Jackson allegedly might have said, "The Chief Justice has made his decision, and now let him enforce it." To put it bluntly, how does a party go from Andrew Jackson to Kamala Harris, and to what extent does American liberalism today owe its heritage to the party of Hamilton and John Quincy Adams, or to the party of Jefferson and Jackson? My take personally is that the Democrats, being the more economically populist party, basically led it to stumble into modern liberalism by mistake, and the Republicans, in turn, being a vehicle for industrialism, something unsuccessful in the agrarian nation that existed under the Federalists, and mildly successful with the Whigs, birthed modern conservatism, something currently very controversial. And speaking of modern conservatism, let's get to the other major party formed during the Jackson presidency. Those being, of course, the Whigs. Everyone loves the Whigs. That's why the Whigs still exist. They don't? Wow, that's terrible. Let's talk about something completely unrelated. So the word Whig comes from Whigamore, a nickname for a Scottish Presbyterian radical during the English Civil War. During the English Civil War, a grueling series of conflicts between the parliamentarians, who would briefly abolish the British monarchy under Oliver Cromwell, the English monarchy rather, and the Royalists under King Charles I, King of Ireland, Scotland, and England at one point, also at times supported by the Scottish. The conflict was for a number of reasons, notable among them the desire for religious reform and Protestantism, the king's unpopular seizures of power from Parliament, as well as Irish and Scottish opposition to the parliamentarian centralization of power in England. Especially strong in Ireland, wherein the Battle of the Boyne is celebrated today by Northern Ireland's Orange Order as a symbol of Protestant domination of Ireland. And also in England's North American colonies at the time, the southern and middle colonies largely lined with the Royalist Cavaliers, with the Catholic barons of Baltimore being strong supporters of the Royalist Cavaliers, while New England, founded and culturally influenced by Puritanism, which opposed the king's influence over the church and was very Protestant, supported the parliamentarians. After the end of the English Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy, but in the heavily parliamentary form the British know and love today, the Liberal and pro-Parliament faction became known as the Whigs, while those more conservative, who in a sense were ideologically descended from the Cavaliers, you could say, but obviously had come to accept the new style of government after the Civil War, became known as Tories, which it surprised me to learn isn't just a contraction of the word conservative, but comes from an Irish word for an outlaw. Anyway, the word Whig, which had a long association with liberalism, as the UK's Liberal Party remained known as the Whigs up until 1859, was suggested as a name for what was then known as the National Republican or Adams-Clay Republican Party, for those who compared their fights with Andrew Jackson to opposing a king. Especially because during the American Revolution, supporters of independence, or patriots, as you might have heard them called in school, were sometimes also called Whigs, and supporters of the king Tories. When anti-Jacksonians, led by the noted senator and multiple-time presidential candidate Henry Clay, who controlled the Senate in 1833, censuring President Jackson. The new party's ideology was, like the Federalists, defined by its political base of the newly wealthy industrialists of the North. Their economic program was called the American System, largely derived from Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist American School of Ideas. While they, as mentioned, only very briefly held the presidency, their economic vision would largely triumph in the increasingly industrialized northern U.S. during this period. A widening gap was opening up between the South's plantation economy and the North's industrializing one, which is one of the bigger causes of the Civil War. The other thing that defined the Whigs was never winning. They only did slightly better than the Federalists, electing in 1840 President William Henry Harrison, who died a month into his term, leaving behind his Vice President John Tyler, who was basically a Democrat, the largely apolitical General Zachary Taylor, and finally, after Taylor died in office, President Millard Fillmore, the last president to be neither a Democrat nor a Republican. In most history textbook, it goes Washington, Jefferson, they built some railroads and expand west, Missouri Compromise, John Brown, blah blah blah, Civil War happens, which makes sense. So as is traditional, let's skip over most stuff before the Civil War. The second party system, which lasted from the 1828 election's total upset of the political system until around the Civil War, was defined by the Whig Party near constantly losing, with them destined to a similar fate to the Federalists, as you could guess by the fact that they don't exist anymore. Specifically, the Whig Party was split in half on the issue of slavery. The 1858 election was the last time the Whigs would even manage to come in second, because by 1856 they had been eclipsed by The Grand Old Party, as they're known today, because they're the second oldest modern party, which makes sense, is, as of when I'm writing this, the holder of a majority in both houses of Congress, the presidency, and de facto the Supreme Court. The GOP was founded in 1856 as an anti-slavery coalition of former Free Soil Democrats, like those who supported Martin Van Buren's 1848 campaign to win a second non-consecutive term. Van Buren being Jackson's successor and co-founder of the Democratic Party. I'm not sure if I'd mentioned that yet. And anti-slavery Whigs. On issues other than slavery, like economics, they largely took after the Whigs, embracing central banking and building more infrastructure, sort of like the American system. We'll get to the later evolution of the Republicans later. The Whigs, as mentioned before, in the 1850s, were falling apart over the slavery issue, bringing an end to the second party system. So the Republicans' first nominee for president was, in 1856, John C. Fremont, who succeeded in flipping most of the North from the Whigs and losing to Democrat James Buchanan, today known as one of the worst presidents ever due to largely sympathizing towards the South and helping exacerbate the Civil War. This isn't a video about the Civil War because that would be irrelevant, but the most important part of the Civil War is that it broke the political power of the Southern planter class, as represented by the Democratic Party, for the next generation. I kind of shied away from this topic earlier to talk about the factions of the party inspired by the Jeffersonian tradition, but immediately, in the decades immediately before the Civil War, the Democrats were the vehicle for the slave power, as Republicans called it, political influence. Abraham Lincoln, surprise, surprise, won the 1860 election. That's probably why you've heard of him before, against a splintered opposition of Unionist Democrats, former Whigs, and Southern Democrats who favored secession. The South, prior to Lincoln's inauguration in the year 1861, seceded, with every slave state except for Missouri and Kentucky, who had competing Confederate governments, and Delaware and Maryland's, so those being the states excluded, joined the Confederate States of America, which selected Mississippi Democrat Jefferson Davis as its first and only president. During the Civil War, Republicans by far dominated politics in the remaining Union states, with so-called war Democrats, like Andrew Johnson, who Lincoln chose as vice president for his 1864 re-election right before the end of the war, supporting the war effort, and peace Democrats, or Copperhead Democrats, named after a type of snake, because, they were like traitors, opposing it. Presumably there was also politics going on in the South at this time, but who cares? Well, it seemed like the pro-negotiated peace Democrat, George McClellan, Civil War general, not very good, might win 1864. The capture of Atlanta by General Ulysses S. Grant right before the election ensured Lincoln's victory, and the national unity ticket of Republican Abraham Lincoln and War Democrat Andrew Johnson won. As you know, right before the end of the war, Lincoln was assassinated, and now Andrew Johnson was to be the president. Some Republicans and Republican adjacents had high hopes for Johnson's presidency, even though he was, a Southerner. Karl Marx wrote around this time to Friedrich Engels, Lincoln's assassination was the most stupid act they could have committed. Johnson is stern, inflexible, and revengeful as a former poor white who has a deadly hatred of the oligarchy. While Andrew Johnson was a drunk and former poor from Tennessee, he would prove to be anything but a fighter of oligarchy. That was very wrong. Now, I would get to the Gilded Age now and talk about how the Democratic Party completely changed to become the one it is now, and the Republicans did the same thing too, but this video seems to be a bit long, and part 2 is going to go from 1865-ish all the way to 2026, so let's end it now. I'm super excited to read the comments of this video about how wrong I am and how Hamilton was a super socially progressive immigrant, etc., etc., but don't worry, I will be even more wrong in part 2. It's going to be better sourced and more interesting because everything since 1860 is more interesting. Sorry. Yeah.